Unboxing TNT, a podcast that unpacks contemporary national issues and advocates for more effective representation and innovative solutions related to those challenges facing all of us. Tune in for fact-driven insights and stakeholder perspectives, and learn how you can do your part to make a real difference. Subscribe on YouTube and follow on social media for updates. Now, let's get started with this episode of Unboxing TNT with your hosts, Anarian Mason and Rudolph Hanamji.
Hello. Welcome, Trinidad and Tobago, to episode 2 of Unboxing TNT with yours truly, Rudolph Hanamji, CEO here at Our Part, the portal for accountability and representation for Trinidad and Tobago, as well as my co-host, none other than our COO here at Our Part, Anarian Mason. Anarian, it's episode 2. What are we unboxing today?
We are unboxing the African Emancipation commemoration that Trinidad and Tobago hosts. Rudolph, I need to firstly remind our subscribers, our viewers actually, to become subscribers because data analytics shows that 90% of you all who are watching are not subscribed. So please hit that like and subscribe button. Follow along on social media, Facebook and Instagram at Our Part, for updates on our episodes and upcoming topics where you can maybe even suggest a topic that you would like to see us unbox. Rudolph. African Emancipation. What does this mean to you, sir?
Well, it's interesting that this year the name was categorically changed or updated to include the word African, because growing up and having studied this in primary school, I always understood this day, this commemorative day, to be about African emancipation. After all, this is such an integral chapter in our history as a post-colonial island, which is still in present day treating with all of these issues and having conversations, real conversations around the effects of emancipation. So to me, the day really was always around reflection on this topic, the legacy that African emancipation has left us with,
Alright.
and the need for us to continue to have these conversations. And what about yourself? I know we're from the same generation,
Of
but
course, yeah.
any different outlook or additional perspectives you've had on the day over the years?
Well, honestly, first of all, you mentioned some of the legacies that African emancipation has brought towards the culture in Trinidad and Tobago. And as you can see, my image today is that not other than the steel pan or steel drum. This, Rudolph, to me is one of the most sweetest instrument there is in the world, if not the most.
Well, for me it is the most, but I hear you.
And to know that this oil drum that was rubbish and being discarded and rusty, thrown away, that the African ancestors who inherited Trinidad and Tobago saw that as innovation and creativity, because when they came across from Africa as slaves, they lost their heritage, they lost so many
Yes.
identifying aspects of themselves. And to look at this and just create this instrument that is worldwide and renowned now is just utterly amazing to me. And
And remember, there was a time when drums were illegal in Trinidad by the colonial masters, and that illegalization, that criminalization of drums led to the tambu bambu, And of
Right.
course, the tambu bamboo led on to other types of percussion innovations, and of course the steel pan. So out of oppression came what I think, as you so well described it, the most symbolic example of innovation, not just for Trinidad and Tobago, but for the world, really.
Yeah, because you'd sit down and you'd listen to music, you'd watch a movie, and in the scores you hear steel pan, and sometimes even watching Avengers Endgame, and I heard steel pan in one of the scores
Yes,
throughout
yes.
that was eye-opening that this multi-billion-dollar franchise used our instrument, our
And that's
national instrument,
why,
that is, as well.
yes, and that's why we want to shout out Kishore and Julian again, who has so generously allowed us to utilize his Hello cover on Steel Pan.
Right.
That's why we've deliberately chosen a steel pan instrumental as our background track. So thank you again, Kishore, Julian. And yes, you're right. This year as well, steel pan was officially, strangely again, as though we needed to, but we needed to, pass a law to make it our national instrument. Again, something I just always thought was a given, but hey, it's in the law books now.
Not only that, Rudolph, but we got a GOI as well, an international GOI, where um,
True,
steel
true.
pans originating out of Trinidad comes with the tag manufactured and created in Trinidad and Tobago. So now on those Philharmonica stages and those concerts, you
Hmm.
would and persons carrying these instruments, they see created in Trinidad and Tobago, and it just brings a sense of patriotic pride to me.
Now, you started off by asking me what emancipation means, but I wonder if enough people understand the history of Emancipation Day in Trinidad and Tobago. Do you think that enough persons in our generation, and older and younger, appreciate what this really is about?
I That's a difficult question because there are a lot of young people now who are paying attention to things from the past to build identity and know where they come from and where they're going. However, there are others who I think wants to forget about it because of what it signifies, what it represents. And to our viewers out there who know or who may not know, Trinidad and Tobago commemorated, let me correct myself, commemorated African Emancipation Day, 39 years running. We are and we the first country in the world to have that commemoration day as a public holiday.
Yes.
But what about you, Rudolph? What is this we're seeing on the screen here?
Well, that was a analysis website, and I really encourage persons ever so often while they're scrolling through Facebook and other social media to jump across to that website, because Nalis has done a fantastic job of documenting and publishing amazing artifacts and historical documents and other information. And they have very simply documented the history of Emancipation Day. And the reason that the then administration saw it fit to establish this commemoration was because we must also remember that our first prime minister was one of the foremost scholars in the area of slavery and colonial history. He single handedly, in many ways, Anarian, guided the academic understanding and research around the economics of slavery. And one of his books, Capitalism and Slavery, it's a book that I had to read when I studied history at Queen's Royal College, where he also went to school, I might add, proudly so. But he outlined in that text categorically how slavery was driven by capitalism. And interestingly, it was not necessarily humanitarianism that led to the abolition of slavery, but indeed the fact that slavery started to become less beneficial from an economic and financial point of view. And again, I really encourage people to go back to our own stories, our own people, and learn about the significance of this day. So it was not created by VAPS. It was connected to our history, and our prime minister saw the importance of creating this commemorative day. And I know it's because this was something that was very close to him, and he understood why it was important for generations coming afterwards to always reflect on this tragedy and to develop their own approaches to dealing with its legacy.
Okay, that is an interesting piece of tidbit news there for our viewers. And again, we'd invite everyone to visit resourceful information, resources that we would link in the descriptions below for you guys to better learn and get that knowledge that we may have already. But this episode, Rudolph, is not really about educating them on what emancipation is it? I think you
No,
have
it isn't.
quite a few things to unbox for us today.
Yes,
So,
and just before we do, I do want to acknowledge Prime Minister George Chambers, who was the one who really ensured that the day was passed as a commemoration. And I remember reading some years ago his own remarks around that time. And our current Prime Minister would have issued an address in relation to the day this year. And Anarian, I think it's interesting again if persons took the time to compare the notes of Prime Minister Keith Rowley to those of George Chambers so many years ago. Unfortunately, I have to say, there are still issues that the Prime Minister has raised that are with us today. So,
alright,
so perhaps we should look at the Prime Minister's remarks and underscore some of the key messages that he has left with us to reflect on.
okay.
If people visit the Prime Minister's website, they will find the full speech. But Anarian, there were a couple paragraphs that stood out to me. The first one was where he said that these achievements, and of course he was reflecting on the many achievements that the country had made, and of course people of African descent included in there. He
Right.
said these achievements must, however, never be taken for granted, but be acknowledged against the wretched history of our African ancestors, their centuries in chains, the destruction of their families and their culture, unspeakable physical brutality, their suffering, their demands for freedom, their long march, all that they endured. So today we can stand as proud citizens of a progressive modern nation. He went on to say that, in short, much of the Western world as we know it was built on the enslavement of Africans. Today, whilst the glory of empire still exists, the shame of the enslavement has not caught up with the much vaunted narratives of civilization. It is
Right.
against this background that our demand for reparation is made even as it continues to be ignored by those who pretend not to be aware of the diaspora's claim against those who continue to benefit from Africa's people and its continental wealth. And he closed off by saying, we have suffered a history of attempts at mental destruction, erosion of self esteem, and our sense of meaning. But in the 21st century, the descendants of the enslaved are rejecting stereotypical descriptions of complacency as we assert our determination, insight, imagination, and distinctiveness. And interestingly, he went on to urge Nalis, which I referred to earlier,
Uh-huh.
to do more to really commemorate and highlight, amplify all of the work that so many outstanding Afro Trinidadians, Afro Trinbagoans, and those of related parentage have done in this area, all of the work that they have achieved and the efforts they've made. And he mentioned people like Stokely Carmichael, otherwise known as Kwame Ture, and Dr. Eustace Williams, of course, Eric Williams, Uriah Butler, CLR James, Earl Lovelace, and of course the list goes on. So, I mean, very interesting commentary there from the Prime Minister. Uh, what are your initial thoughts around his remarks?
I honestly believe we need to understand where we've come from and where we're going. And by remembering these situations and by having these discussions, by calling things to place, we can't really forget that. And by Nalis now doing more to highlight and to show the achievements of Afro Trinidadian Trinbagonians, it would better serve as, I mean, Nalis is the National Archives for Trinidad and Tobago, and we look
Hmm.
at it. And they highlighting it, it being accessible to the general public now makes everyone want to know more by it being in news, as simple as news and the media coverage, things like that can happen. And Rudolph, I honestly think that the African society has been ostracized. There's so much to discuss, to unpack along that, including intergenerational trauma and what it means to be for that to be passed down from lineage to lineage.
That is perhaps one of the most understated and oftentimes ignored components in this multi layered issue. That intergenerational trauma, I mean, some of us, we can only, of course, experience it as observers. We can experience it through intersectional observation.
All right.
I mean, obviously, every Trinidad and Tobago citizen, whether they like to admit it or not, is in some way integrated within all of the cultures, the ethnicities, the religions, the, the belief systems that run through our nation, right? But our generation, and Aryan in particular, I sometimes refer to us as the Dougla generation
All right.
because we have interestingly been born out of a mixing of the ethnicities and the religions, and many of us are mixed race. Many of us have grown up in a time where it was easier for us to intermingle, to fall in love with someone of a different ethnicity, to befriend people from different backgrounds. So
All right.
I will go out on a limb to say that perhaps unlike our older generations, we might better appreciate what some of our African Trinbagonian brothers and sisters go through because of how close we are to them. But
Right.
you are right that uh, people talk about emancipation, but do we really take the time to properly appreciate and understand all of the different issues that have come out of this one tragedy? And I don't think that we do enough. I think that that is why this day remains important to have on our calendar.
Okay. And I mean, at the same time, being growing up in the same environment with you, like you did, we didn't see race, we didn't see color, we didn't see religion. It was always something to be amazed by it, good at that. But the thing is, the Africans, slaves who came across from Africa, they lost their indigenous heritage, they lost their religion, and like I mentioned earlier, they lost their instruments, their culture.
Yes.
Some even lost their names,
Oh,
and
yes.
they were given the names. Either they were not given names at all, or they were given names of the person who bought them. And that identity crisis still occurs today because we have so many persons who don't know who's their actual family, whether they're related to someone based on who came across and the names. A name is,
Yes.
is your identity that you're given at birth, and for persons that now take that away from you is very heartening and disheartening and heartbreaking.
And I think that is why the Prime Minister went on to reference the matter of reparations. Because, again, it's easy for younger generations, and I don't just mean our generation as millennials, but generations that came after emancipation, let's say in the last 60 years, 60 to 80 years, it would have been easier for some of them to undervalue the importance of this movement, to have the international community that he referenced, those that benefited and still benefit from the legacy of slavery, to find a way to contribute to restorative justice. And again, I would really encourage people to spend some time in researching these areas, because the just before Emancipation Day this year, the committee on the National Committee on Reparations was actually reconstituted. And I think it's important for us to take in, Anarian, a few of the opening remarks from that session. And here we have an interesting perspective on one of the topics that is not usually considered in discussing the modern day impacts of slavery.
At a joint conference organized by the Center for Reparation Research and Rutgers University, the keynote speaker, Professor Mimi Scheller, reminded us that colonialism is a founding moment of the contemporary climate crisis and was generated by the system of plantation slavery. Therefore, we must intensify our demand for climate reparations. Scheller highlights a suitable climate approach to reparation. And this is what she said. If we were to extend the case for slavery reparations to encompass A, the damage to island environments by plantations and the destitution of populations descended from enslavement, which have left them especially vulnerable to climate change, and B, the role of chattel slavery in the financial foundations of global economies, banks and insurance firms that have directly financed the rise of multinational fossil fuel and mining extractive economies. then we could show that these beneficiaries have exposed the Caribbean to ecological damage, social vulnerability, and high risk from climate extremes. And
Now that, Anarian, is something I know is very close to your heart. But have you ever considered climate change and its impacts in that context of being one of the tragedies that came out of slavery? I mean, interesting point, isn't it?
I mean, I can understand it now that I'm hearing about it, but it's a unique perspective to know that again, an African person of African descent within the Caribbean brought this ideology forward. It's just so astounding, Rudolph. And I can understand, I mean, when it is they came across, the place was, the lands and them were fertile with different crops like sugarcane, cocoa, and these things, and they started harvesting. By harvesting, they reduce the greenery on the islands, and that in itself caused carbon dioxide to increase, less oxygen, things like that. The normal carbon, the cycle behind climate change. But to know that the slavery aspect is a contributor to the climate change that is currently affecting the Caribbean, it's just amazing and sad at the same time.
Well, Professor Shepard has been leading research in this area for decades, and she has really been able to frame the multi-dimensional, multi-layered issue of reparations, and in a manner that I think is accessible to so many out there. And I really encourage people to take in the fullness of her remarks. And she in turn has referenced a number of other scholars in this area. But apart from climate change, which is of course an issue on our doorsteps as small island developing states, she went on to talk a little bit more about the econometrics behind reparations. And again, I think it is important for us as Caribbean people to understand the fullness of the scenario, because when people think of reparations, they may have in their mind a very simplified view that somebody is going to send money and that money is going to end up in individuals' hands. But when persons like Professor Shepard and others unpack and unbox this issue, what they're really making a case for is a type of reinvestment where the economies, the advanced economies of the world that benefited, and as I said, still benefit from the legacy of slavery, they are asking for these economies to allocate funding that will be invested into sustainable projects and programs, and there's a reason for it. And let me go back to Professor Shepard for a moment, because of course she will explain it much better than I can.
takes cash to care. So calculations are ongoing about the cost of these crimes against humanity. And this next slide shows that the recent calculation by the Brattle Group of Economists in the United States, working with historians, former ICJ Judge Patrick Robinson, and others, is 19 trillion US dollars for the CARICOM region from Britain alone. And I think it's 101.4 trillion US dollars for the region. And I think the Brattle Group is even as we speak, updating their calculations. And beside that is the percentage of the, I suppose, the GDP of each country that will be paid out in reparation. Now, the next slide reminds us of the historical injustices committed by Europeans that many are trying unsuccessfully to quantify. But those who do the research about such injustices are critical to the advancement of our work. And you can see that the injustices have been described by the DDPA. And of course, your own Dr. Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery shows that economic benefits of slavery to Britain were real. So does Professor Hilary Beckles in his Britain's Black Debt. But as the next slide shows, reminds us, Trinidad and Tobago's own Sir Ellis Clarke at a conference on colonialism in 1964 emphasized the injustice of economic extraction and the failure to pay reparation by former and current colonizing powers. And I really believe that this extract should be embraced by all reparation activists.
I mean, you really can't get away, Anarian, from the poignancy of
But
those references.
of course not. And to know that it's going on for so long
Yes.
is just amazing. It's a wonder. But like Dr. Beckles said there, it is important for the persons who are doing the research into it to continue their research, even though they might not see the reward today, tomorrow always comes. And Rudolph, as you know, one of my most favorite quotes of all time is always, if not me, then who? If not today, then when?
Then when? Hmm.
And I think we need to call on young historians, young people within Trinidad and Tobago who wants to see justice for our country, who wants to see the reparations be achieved in their lifetime, to dedicate an hour or two into research away from their normal jobs, from their normal daily lives, and dedicate an hour or two into doing this research, finding the data, finding the quotations, finding the whatever it takes to get this done. Because we can't have the injustice being continued. Are we really free? Are the African community really free if it is the reparations and not foreseen or not executed?
Well, I mean, that has been the ongoing debate. Persons have sung about it, books and reports have been written on the topic. People sometimes jest about it because it is a touchy subject, right? But that concept of physical versus mental enslavement is still with us today. I mean, we have so much more understanding in today's world about mental health and wellness and the impacts of trauma and post traumatic stress disorder on humans. It's one of the reasons why a number of corporate entities are taking environmental, social, and governance framework so important, because under the in actually in all three pillars there are movements to pass new legislation, regulations, and industrial relations practices to support this ongoing effort to understand how people's identities, their histories, their socioeconomic backgrounds, their ancestry, etc., are affecting them in the modern world. And governments across the world, for example, have passed modern day slavery legislation.
Right.
And it just proves that even though we are commemorating the end of one form of slavery, it does not mean that slavery is no longer part of the human experience, which it has been for millennia, but
Right.
also that the impacts of slavery are not with us still. They are front and center. And I know that there are so many commentaries each year around this to just bring it back home to Trinidad and Tobago. I mean, of course, persons would have referenced the effects of slavery on today's youth, on the socio-economic disparities, the education system,
Right.
the criminal justice system, etc. I mean, you've spoken about some of these things in different fora. What are your thoughts on how can we as a young generation really contribute to unboxing these issues better?
As in um, modern slavery.
and
Modern,
and yeah, modern slavery and the modern effects of slavery that are still with us.
well, modern slavery actually is all in the mindset because you have now there are so many human rights laws that is being observed that the UN is enforcing. Let's not look at the global space at this point in time because it might seem a little down. But there are so many ways that persons can speak out for themselves. There is the whole self identity and sexual identity through the LGBTQIA forum. Persons now have that compassion or that's freedom to say what they are, what they believe. And mental slavery is a thing that you can only get help for if you seek it out. Now, we understand that socioeconomic standing from the fact that your ancestors were middle class or low class, and it continued going over and over and over down to the point that persons are now seem to be in the ghetto. But there are others who experience the very same thing and they are in the upper class of the caste, the socioeconomic system. What becomes the difference between upper and lower is the fact that persons start to think outside of the box, they start to invest in themselves, they stop taking on the burden of the father and start becoming an individual. And we need to educate young people on how to do that. Now, another reference you would have heard me use a couple of times in forums would have been we are taught to color within the lines of a coloring book, yet as adults, they expect us to think outside of the box. So we now
Yes.
need to break that mentality, that brainwashing that we experience as young children and young people into that innovative sector and into that innovation, that survival mode aspect, that hustler mode aspect to become better. Now, outside of that, you need to look at the crime situation, especially here in Trinidad and Tobago, because again, we're unboxing TNT. And
Hmm.
crime situation in Trinidad and Tobago has become so horrendous, Rudolph, it feels like they are invisible chains holding us back. Because at the end of the day, crime holds you as a slave because you are now afraid to go outside. It has taken away your freedom,
Certainly. Yeah.
your right to walk about, your right to wear gold or jewelry itself. So it may not be your religion or it may not be your family name, but in some way, crime has taken away that very significance of you being who you are. And that is what slavery was about. It stole an identity of a people. And here in Trinidad and Tobago, crime has become the British and the Spanish, whilst the citizens, every citizen in Trinidad and Tobago has become that of the African people.
Wow. That is an interesting perspective and analogy. I'm feeling that as you're speaking.
So, what is your take on young people escaping mental slavery and modern slavery?
It does begin with us supporting each other and having these conversations. They're difficult conversations to have, and you know, you can't just wait on the vulnerable and at risk communities. That's what we practice, is what we understand, right? In the type of work that we get involved in, people with privileges, people who are sometimes not directly impacted by these issues, have to be the ones to create space and to give a hand up, not a hand out, but a hand up to those who are actually experiencing the effects firsthand, because it really is inequitable to expect that the persons who are directly being oppressed should be the ones to also be activists in their own regard. Yes, they have to have their voice and we have to facilitate that. But it starts sometimes with other people creating that space. And in this year's Emancipation Day parade formal ceremony, Dr. Hilary Beckles said a lot of things that, again, I think should be shared in schools, that the millennial generation needs to take up wholly. We can no longer continue to wait for our elders to resolve these problems. And I think it's important for viewers to hear a little bit from Dr. Beckles in that regard.
Of course, of course.
Is a battle that we have won. It's a battle that has cost us very dearly in human life. For 400 years in this Caribbean, there wasn't a generation of African people in this region who did not go to war to end slavery. From island to island, across the mainland, the African people in the Caribbean and beyond fought and won this battle. And we have every right to celebrate this victory. But celebration of a victory in a battle does not mean that you have won the war. The war is yet to be won. The struggle must continue because there will be many other battles that we have to win before we can declare a victory in the war. I wish to emphasize also that we must see emancipation both as an event, which it was, an act of the British Parliament passed, it was an event. But for us, emancipation is a process. It's an ongoing process. We need to take a new guard, and this is why. We have a younger generation of men who we are struggling to bring them integrated into the society and the economy as responsible citizens. And both in Kingston, Jamaica, and Port of Spain, Trinidad, we have a problem with young male black crime. We have this problem in Port of Spain and in Kingston, Jamaica. We have this problem. I am not a believer in blaming the victims. There is an explanation that we have to understand. Younger generations do not believe that they are given the same treatment to be equal citizens. I know that in this country, the governments over the years have spent an enormous amount of money on the education of working class people. I know that as a fact. In fact, this republic spends more money per capita on education than any other in the region. Now, despite that enormous investment in young people, access to secondary, tertiary education supported by the state, we still have a group of young men who are resistant to the stimulation. The stimulation is there. Here's access. Here are programs. The state is going to invest. Why is it that we have a percentage that has turned its back on the society's values? We have the same situation in Kingston. We have the same situation in Kingston. This is not a problem to be dealt with in terms of a blame game. There's no blaming. There is only understanding. There is only comprehension. There's no blaming to be had. What did we do? What did we do wrong? Or what did we not do enough of to avoid these circumstances over the last 60 years? I have one or two things to consider. I have heard the argument that crime is effectively a public health crisis. I support that thesis because I know that the psychological harm that has been done to our people generation over generation is enormous. So when we speak of reparations, we're not just speaking about throwing money at the issue. We have to find a way to rehabilitate these young people, bring them equally in, and it requires psychological and public health interventions. In other words, we have to start again with a new guard to look at this problem through different eyes.
There you go. Look at this problem through different eyes, a new guard. So he answers both of our questions as younger people. He's telling us we have to form the new guard, right?
Correct. And again, the innovative thinking behind the African society I would have never looked at crime as a health.
Mhm.
It really goes to show what we can learn and what we have to learn from it. And you see it every day where the majority of murders taking place in the majority of larceny and criminal activities, even down to Raymond Yard and Golden Grove, is more filled with African males than anything else.
Yes, and I can hear your dogs are agreeing with us. The fact of the matter is that there's been so much beauty contributed to our society, as with any other ethnic group. But like my background photograph, for example, is of traditional batik and African prints that people, that tourists, for example, invest in a lot when they visit Englishman's Bay or Tobago. And some of us have also purchased because the colors, the creativity, the expression. So we must always remember that in all cultures, in all people, there's the potential for innovation, as you said, and beauty and creation. But if, as Dr. Beckles says, we are not acutely treating with the root causes of problems, then they will simply be reinforced and those statistics will continue. So at the end of the day, Anarian, we've started this podcast, Unboxing TNT, to really try and review, demystify, separate some of the layers of these very complex matters. And of course, we can't do all of it in 1 hour, but what would be some of your calls to action for our generation in particular, given some of the layers that we've touched on in episode 2 of Unboxing TNT today?
Well, my first recommendation would be that everyone, no matter your generation, no matter your race, your ethnicity, your religion, you take the time to educate and re educate yourself on certain topics and situations and history, and that now paints the way on how we can move forward. What is one of your recommendations, Rudolph?
Well, in line with what you just said, we must continue to be that Dougla generation and denounce racism, misperceptions, and stereotypes. We have been able to break down and stand up against our parents and grandparents in many regards because we all know what were some of the things that they may have grown up saying. And again, it all goes back to learned behavior, prejudice, bullying, racism, xenophobia. All of these things are learned practices. Children aren't born with these belief systems. So young people have to educate themselves, as you said, and not just keep the information to themselves. I'm saying use it to really stand as an ally. I said this earlier, you don't have to be directly from an at-risk or vulnerable population or the direct population. You can use the knowledge that you have. If you hear people reinforcing certain negative stereotypes or making uninformed statements, you have to use your knowledge to correct them. You don't always reach everyone, but you at least can change a few mindsets.
And all it takes, Rudolph, is one person to change one mind, and that alone extrapolates and can turn into such a curveball within this nature. Because, as you very well know, Trinidad and Tobago's political landscape is very much tribal. And those of us who consider ourselves as the Douglas very rarely stand up and vote. And this is a call to action because you know very well that we have an upcoming general election next year. And I am asking our viewers and those who you influence to now take the time to use that messaging and stay away from the tribal politics and vote based on informed decisions.
That is an excellent point. And the data continues to show that the two main voting blocks are ethnically divided to a large degree, but there's close to 40+% of the voting population that does not actively take part in the general elections, and perhaps quite rightly for some of the reasons that you are intimating. At the end of the day, this is really a call for restorative justice at all levels. And it is time that we look at the criminal justice system, we look at public policy, we utilize our innovative mindsets to break cycles. How do we proactively reform the education system? Both of us come from what are called privileged schools, but we both of us have been advocates that all schools should be privileged at the end of the day. There should be equity and equality in education access. So at the end of the day, we really have to love love our people, all of our people, and be champions for equity, accountability, representation, and hence why we would have started our part, the portal for accountability and representation for Trinidad and Tobago. And Unboxing TNT is just one of our initiatives that we are trying to leverage to educate the wider population and ensure that we can really have a better TNT. So, as we come to the end of this episode, where we unboxed African Emancipation Again, we referenced to a large degree some of the prevailing sentiments as shared by the current Prime Minister, who, as I said, would his comments, unfortunately, are still treating in 2024 with issues that the then Prime Minister George Chambers referenced when the administration took the decision to create Emancipation Day, now formally called African Emancipation Day. And also, scholars and other influencers in society for many years have been treating with the issues of the legacy of slavery and the need for restorative justice, facilitated by reparations, for example. So remember to follow us on Instagram and Facebook. You can contact us at we must do at our part with 2ts.org. I want to thank all of the contributors and the agencies that we would have referenced for today's program, and look out for episode 3 of Unboxing TNT, which will be published next Monday. For now, thank you for joining us, and we are leaving you with some of the tunes of Kishon Julian as he covers Hello on Steel Pan. Thank you, and do be safe. Until next time, from us at Our Part.